Hey, have you ever heard of a lawyer using the Twinkie defense? That's what we're going to talk about today on MysterE's Mysteries. I am MysterE, and we're going to talk about all things mysterious in the world of psychology. So, this episode is called the Twinkie Defense, and it's a story from the late 1970s. And it's a super fascinating story, directly related to the insanity defense, which you have listened to me talk to if you've heard some of the previous episodes. Directly related to the insanity defense, and a very powerful historical story that actually was made into a movie in 2008 called Milk, starring Sean Penn and Josh Brolin. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the backstory, and then we're going to hear about where the Twinkie defense comes into play. So back in the 1970s, San Francisco was a hub of liberal activism, progressivism, and it was a growing population of homosexuals in the Castro district of San Francisco. And the first ever duly elected homosexual was from the Castro region in San Francisco, and his name is Harvey Milk, and he was one of the board of supervisors, which, depending on where you're from, you might call them alder people or council members, whatever. But it was called the board of supervisors in San Francisco, and Harvey Milk was the first openly gay elected official in the United States. And he worked with the mayor of San Francisco at the time, whose name was George Moscone. And he also worked with another board of supervisors, gentleman by the name of Dan White. And in the late 1970s, they were all working together. Dan White was a Democrat, but he leaned a little bit more towards the conservative stance. He was from a middle-class white kind of suburban district, whereas Harvey Milk was from the predominantly gay Castro district. But they still worked pretty well together for the most part. And so there wasn't really a whole lot of tension. They actually got along. In fact, Harvey Milk was one of three people that was invited to Dan White's child's baptism. So there wasn't a tremendous amount of animosity there. Well, after a year or so, the city council members and George Moscone were very interested in creating a home, a juvenile offender facility for juveniles that had committed pretty horrific crimes, so like murder, rape, assault, arson, etc. And they wanted to put it in Dan White's district. And Dan White was very opposed to this. But George Moscone and Harvey Milk and George Moscone were both for this initiative, had enough votes to have this pretty close to passing. So Dan White, acting a little bit emotionally, resigned on the spot. And after he resigned, many of his constituents and other members of the community talked to him and said, listen, you might be the deciding vote on this. We need you to not resign. Well, he already resigned. And Dan White went back to George Moscone, the mayor of San Francisco, and said, hey, could you appoint me to my old position? And George Moscone actually thought about it, but then he was talking to a couple other people, including Harvey Milk, and they said, well, how about we go ahead and appoint somebody who is a little bit more liberal that would go along with this vote? And George Moscone was like, yeah, we really want to get this passed, so let's go ahead and do it. So that's what happened. And so Dan White didn't get his spot back. And this was in the fall of 1978. And Dan White was fairly distraught about it. He was upset about the situation, but nobody knew to what extent. And on November 27th, 1978, Dan White snuck through a window at City Hall, and he went up to George Mosconi's office, and he asked Mosconi if he could meet with him privately. Mosconi said yes. Little did he know that Dan White had a gun on him, and Dan White shot and killed the mayor of San Francisco right in this room adjacent to his office. Mind-blowing, right? And then he walked across City Hall into Harvey Milk's office after he reloaded his gun and shot and killed Harvey Milk. So he turned himself in immediately, said that he did it, and then it went to trial. And during the trial, his defense team, they said, we are going to go for not guilty by reason of, it wasn't called reason of insanity, but something called diminished capacity, that he had the inability to premeditate his crime because he was suffering from depression that was partially due to his poor diet. And the newspaper at the time went along with this, and the newspaper titled it the Twinkie Defense. Now, the defense team, Dan White's team, did not use the Twinkie Defense. They had just mentioned in passing that one of their experts was talking about how this poor diet could have manifested itself into a greater level of depression. And this level of depression led to Dan White being unable to premeditate this crime. Now, mind you, he went through a window so he would avoid metal detectors. He also brought his gun, and he brought extra ammunition. Yet they still tried to find him not guilty guilty, but diminished capacity. Well, the defense said that as a former police officer, he's used to bringing his gun places. He's used to bringing extra ammunition. And many people in City Hall, I guess, went through a window to get in there to avoid the metal detectors. I don't know, but that's what they used. So they used this Twinkie defense, and Dan White was not convicted of murder. He was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and for the shooting of George Mosconi, the mayor of San Francisco, and Harvey Milk, one of the lead board of supervisors. He received, through this voluntary manslaughter, a sentence of 7 years in prison, in which he only served 5 years. And once again, shortly after this verdict, California eliminated their diminished capacity defense. And if you remember from my previous podcast, several years later, when John Hinckley Jr. attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan, many states completely eliminated the insanity defense. So once again, we have another case in the Twinkie defense where the verdict ended up leading to a massive change in the criminal justice system. So that is the Twinkie defense. I hope you enjoyed it. I am MysterE. This is MysterE's Mysteries. Make sure that you follow us on Twitter, X, Instagram, YouTube Shorts, and then our podcasts are on Spotify, Apple, anywhere you can find podcasts. And once again, thank you to my producer and director, Bear Wade, and Unify Creative Agency. If you are interested in getting some help getting your podcast started, starting a business, wanting to be an influencer, he's the guy to see. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.